The morning of June 18th, 1815 dawned grey and miserable over the rolling hills of Belgium. Rain had fallen through the night, turning the earth into a quagmire of mud and blood waiting to be spilled. In a few short hours, this unremarkable patch of countryside near a small village called Waterloo would become the stage for one of history's most decisive battles. Here, beneath storm clouds that seemed to mirror the darkness of the moment, the fate of Europe would be decided by steel and gunpowder, courage and desperation. On one side of the field stood Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once bestrode the continent like a colossus, the emperor who had crushed Austria, humbled Prussia, and sent the crowned heads of Europe fleeing in terror, the general whose very name could inspire his soldiers to march through hell itself. But this was not the Napoleon of Austerlitz or Jena. This was a man fighting for his political life, his legacy, and perhaps his very survival. Across the muddy expanse, the Duke of Wellington's allied army waited in carefully chosen positions.
Are we
British
ready?
redcoats,
I don't know if we are.
Dutch militiamen,
Stay calm.
German veterans, and Belgian conscripts formed a polyglot force that spoke a dozen languages but shared one common purpose: to stop Napoleon Bonaparte once and for all. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, Prussian columns under Marshal Blücher were marching through the morning mist, racing to join the battle that would decide whether the Corsican upstart would rise again or fall forever. What unfolded that day was more than just another battle in the endless wars that had torn Europe apart for over 2 decades. It was the climax of one man's extraordinary ambition, the moment when dreams of empire collided with the harsh reality of coalition warfare. The thunder of cannon and the clash of bayonets would echo far beyond the blood-soaked fields of Belgium, reshaping the political landscape of an entire continent and bringing to a close an era that had begun with revolution and would end in exile. But to understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold at Waterloo, we must first travel back to the events that brought Napoleon to this desperate gamble. The story begins not with the roar of artillery, but with the quiet splash of oars cutting through Mediterranean waters on a February night in 1815.
Yes,
For nearly
the
11
ridge.
months, Napoleon had been
This
a
gives
prisoner
us
on
the
the island of
advantage.
Elba, watching from his Mediterranean exile as the Bourbon monarchy stumbled through its restoration. The Congress of Vienna was redrawing the map of Europe, carving up his empire like butchers dividing a carcass. The man who had
Up,
once held the
guards,
destiny of
and at
nations
them.
in his hands was reduced
At
to
them.
governing a tiny island with a handful of guards and a rapidly dwindling treasury. Yet even in exile, the fire of ambition burned within him. He studied the reports from France with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The restored King Louis XVIII was deeply unpopular. The army remained loyal to their former emperor. The people groaned under new taxes and the return of the old aristocracy. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. Under cover of darkness, he slipped away from Elba with just over 1,000 men aboard a small flotilla of ships. It was either the most audacious gamble of his career or the desperate act of a man who had nothing left to lose.
Hold the line.
Perhaps it was both. The journey to the French coast took only 2 days, but those 48 hours must have felt like an eternity for the exiled emperor. Every moment brought the risk of discovery by British or French warships. Every league closer to France increased the stakes of his impossible wager. When his ships finally reached the Gulf of Juan on the southern French coast, Napoleon and his small band of followers stepped ashore to face an uncertain destiny. What happened next defied all expectations and demonstrated the magnetic power Napoleon still wielded over the French imagination. Rather than slinking through the countryside like a fugitive, he chose to march boldly toward Paris, along the route that would become known as the Route Napoleon. Village after village welcomed him with wild enthusiasm. Peasants and townspeople lined the roads, cheering the return of their emperor. But the real test would come when he encountered the royal forces sent to stop him. Near Grenoble, Napoleon faced his first and perhaps most crucial moment of truth. A regiment of the royal army had been dispatched to capture the escaped exile and his followers. As the two forces drew near each other on the mountain road, Napoleon made a decision that would become the stuff of legend. Dismounting from his horse, he walked alone toward the government troops, their muskets raised and ready. When he came within range, he stopped, opened his coat, and shouted words that would echo through history. "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, like a dam bursting, came the response that Napoleon had gambled everything to hear. Vive l'Empereur! The soldiers threw down their white Bourbon cockades and rushed to embrace their former leader. The Restoration government had sent an army to capture Napoleon. Instead, they had given him reinforcements. This scene repeated itself across France as Napoleon's small band grew into a procession, then a movement, then an avalanche of popular enthusiasm. Regiments sent to oppose him joined his ranks instead. Officials fled their posts rather than face the returning emperor. The momentum of his march became unstoppable, a political earthquake that shattered the fragile foundations of the restored monarchy. King Louis XVIII, watching from Paris as his authority evaporated like morning mist, made the only decision available to him. Rather than face the humiliation of confronting his rival, he fled the capital under cover of darkness, taking with him the last vestiges of Bourbon legitimacy. When Napoleon's carriage rolled through the gates of the Tuileries on March 20th, he found the throne of France vacant and waiting. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon was emperor once again, but his triumph was shadowed by the knowledge that his enemies would not accept his return. Across Europe, the crowned heads who had thought themselves safe from the Corsican threat received the news with alarm and fury. The Congress of Vienna, still in session, declared Napoleon an outlaw and committed themselves to his destruction. Within days, the great powers of Europe began mobilizing their armies for what they swore would be the final campaign against the man they now viewed as a plague upon the peace of nations. Napoleon understood the gravity of his situation better than anyone. He had perhaps 3 months before the combined armies of Europe would descend upon France like a pack of wolves. His only chance of survival lay in striking first, defeating his enemies before they could unite their overwhelming strength against him. It was a strategy born of desperation, but executed with the tactical genius that had made him master of Europe. The emperor's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than wait for his enemies to invade France, he would carry the war into Belgium, where Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blücher's Prussian forces were slowly concentrating. If he could defeat these two armies separately before they could coordinate their efforts, he might shatter the coalition against him and secure his throne. It was a gamble worthy of the man who had once said that he would rather face a coalition of enemies than a single great general. As spring turned to summer, both sides prepared for the confrontation that everyone knew was inevitable. Napoleon gathered his veterans and conscripts, melding them into an army that still carried the traditions and fighting spirit of the Grande Armée. Meanwhile, Wellington and Blücher worked to coordinate their diverse forces into an effective fighting machine. The stage was set for a collision that would determine not just the fate of Napoleon Bonaparte, but the future of Europe itself. The summer heat of 1815 hung heavy over the Belgian countryside as two of history's greatest military minds prepared for their ultimate confrontation. Wellington, the Iron Duke who had never lost a battle, positioned his multinational army with the cold precision of a chess master. His forces were a patchwork of nations and languages, British redcoats standing shoulder to shoulder with Dutch militia, German legionnaires beside Belgian conscripts. Many had never heard a shot fired in anger, yet they would soon face the most feared army in Europe. The Duke understood his weaknesses better than anyone. Of his 93,000 men, barely a third were seasoned British veterans. The rest were an untested mixture of allies whose loyalty and courage remained question marks written in gunpowder and steel. Wellington himself had called his own army infamous, a candid assessment that spoke volumes about the challenge he faced. Yet this master of defensive warfare had chosen his ground with the eye of a surgeon, selecting the precise point for a life-saving incision. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean offered everything Wellington needed. A reverse slope that would hide his men from French artillery, solid flanks anchored by the chateau of Hougoumont and the farm of La Haye-Sainte, and most crucially, a position that would allow Blücher's Prussians to join the battle when they arrived, if they arrived. The Prussian marshal had promised to march to Wellington's aid, but promises made in the heat of planning often melted away in the crucible of actual combat. 20 miles to the east, Marshal Blücher was fighting his own desperate race against time. His Prussian army had been mauled at Ligny just 2 days earlier, scattered and bloodied by Napoleon's masterful assault. Lesser commanders might have retreated to lick their wounds and wait for reinforcements, But Blücher was cut from different cloth. At 72 years old, the man his soldiers called Old Forward possessed the heart of a warrior half his age and the stubborn determination of a Prussian general who had watched Napoleon humiliate his nation too many times. Through the muddy roads of Belgium, Prussian columns slogged toward the sound of distant guns. Staff officers rode back and forth, coordinating the movement of 4 corps across treacherous terrain. The message was simple, but urgent. Wellington was making his stand at Waterloo. If the Prussians could arrive in time, they might trap Napoleon between 2 armies and end his reign forever. If they failed to reach the battlefield, the Duke's outnumbered forces would face annihilation. Napoleon himself seemed strangely confident. As the morning of June 18th dawned, perhaps it was the familiar rhythm of preparation before battle, the sight of his beloved Imperial Guard forming their ranks with mechanical precision. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that he had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious through sheer force of will and tactical genius. The emperor who had conquered half of Europe surely could not be stopped by a collection of second-rate troops commanded by a general he had never faced. The French army that assembled on the field south of Waterloo was a formidable instrument of war. 72,000 men organized into the killing machine that had terrorized Europe for over a decade. At its heart stood the Imperial Guard, 22,000 of the finest soldiers on earth. These were men who had marched from Madrid to Moscow, who had planted French eagles on the battlefields of a dozen nations. They had never known defeat, and their very presence on any battlefield was enough to strike fear into enemy hearts. The Guard was divided into 3 distinct formations, each with its own proud traditions and battle honors. The young Guard consisted of recent recruits, eager to prove themselves worthy of their elite status. The Middle Guard were veterans of Napoleon's greatest campaigns, men who had learned their trade in the furnaces of Austerlitz and Jena. But it was the Old Guard who commanded universal respect and fear. These grizzled warriors had followed Napoleon since his earliest days, through the pyramids of Egypt and the snows of Russia. They were the living embodiment of French military glory, the final reserve that their emperor would commit only when victory hung in the balance. As the morning wore on, Napoleon faced a decision that would haunt military historians for generations. The ground was sodden from the previous night's torrential rain, turning the battlefield into a muddy morass that would slow cavalry charges and make artillery movement difficult. Common sense dictated waiting for the earth to dry, allowing his guns to be positioned effectively and his cavalry to operate at full efficiency. Yet every hour of delay gave Blücher more time to march to Wellington's aid. The emperor chose to wait. Perhaps he believed his own intelligence reports that the Prussians were in full retreat and posed no immediate threat. Perhaps he simply could not conceive of attacking under such disadvantageous conditions. Whatever his reasoning, those precious morning hours slipped away like water through his fingers. The sun climbed higher, slowly baking the moisture from the Belgian soil, but also bringing the distant Prussian columns closer to the battlefield with every passing minute. When Napoleon finally gave the order to advance, it was nearly midday. The delay had been fatal, though none could know it yet. As French infantry columns formed up for the assault, as artillery crews wheeled their guns into position, as cavalry regiments checked their sabers and adjusted their bridles, the fate of Europe hung suspended like a sword above the heads of 140,000 men, about to collide in one of history's most savage encounters. The battle would be decided not just by courage and firepower, but by time itself. Could Napoleon smash Wellington's line before the Prussians arrived? Could Wellington's mixed army hold long enough for reinforcements to tip the balance? The answers to these questions would be written in blood across the fields of Belgium, in a struggle that would echo through the ages as the day an empire died and a new world was born. The first shots of Waterloo rang out at 11:30 in the morning, not from Napoleon's grand battery as many expected, but from a diversionary assault on the chateau of Hougomont. This fortified manor house on Wellington's right flank was more than just a building. It was a fortress within a fortress, its thick walls and enclosed courtyard offering a perfect strongpoint for determined defenders. Napoleon's younger brother, Jerome, led the attack with his division, believing that a quick capture would force Wellington to weaken his main line by sending reinforcements. But the emperor had underestimated both the strength of the position and the tenacity of its defenders. The Coldstream Guards and other British units had barricaded themselves inside the chateau like medieval knights preparing for siege. Every window became a loophole, every doorway a death trap for attackers. The French assault waves crashed against the walls like ocean breakers against granite cliffs, achieving nothing but mounting casualties and growing frustration. What began as a simple diversion evolved into a grinding battle of attrition that would consume thousands of men throughout the day. French infantry charged again and again, only to be cut down by disciplined volleys from the defenders. At one point, a small group of French soldiers managed to break through the north gate, but they were overwhelmed and killed in the courtyard, their bodies a grim testament to the futility of the assault. The chateau had become a magnet for French attacks, drawing away precious troops and resources that Napoleon would desperately need elsewhere. While Hougoumont burned and bled, Napoleon prepared his main assault. The Grand Battery, 84 cannons arranged in a devastating line, began its thunderous bombardment of Wellington's Ridge. The earth shook with each salvo, and the air filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men and horses. Shot and shell tore through the Allied ranks, but Wellington had positioned his troops on the reverse slope, partially protecting them from the worst of the artillery fire. The Duke rode among his men with calm confidence, his presence a steadying influence on troops who had never faced such concentrated firepower. He wore his usual blue coat and white breeches, as if attending a social gathering rather than commanding in the battle of his life. When officers suggested he take cover from the French guns, he replied with characteristic understatement that he had business to attend to on the ridge. His sang-froid was infectious, helping to maintain discipline among formations that lesser leadership might have seen crumble under the relentless bombardment. At 1 o'clock, Napoleon unleashed the first of his great infantry assaults. d'Erlon's corps, 18,000 strong, advanced in massive columns toward the center of Wellington's line. These were not the skirmishing tactics of earlier wars, but the hammer blows of imperial warfare. The columns moved forward like living battering rams, their drummers beating the pas de charge, while officers shouted encouragement and threats in equal measure. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. French tricolors snapped in the wind above forests of bayonets as the columns closed the distance to Wellington's Ridge. The very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of so many marching feet. Veterans of a dozen campaigns advanced, with the mechanical precision of men who had conquered half of Europe. This was the Grande Armée in all its terrible glory, the instrument that had humbled emperors and toppled kingdoms. But Wellington had prepared for exactly this moment. His infantry waited in line formation, 2 ranks deep, their muskets loaded and bayonets fixed. As the French columns crested the ridge, they met a wall of disciplined firepower that stopped them in their tracks. British volleys crashed into the packed ranks of attackers, each shot finding multiple targets in the dense formations. Men fell in windows, their places immediately filled by comrades stepping over the bodies of the fallen. The French pressed forward with desperate courage, but mathematics was against them. Only the front ranks of each column could fire, while Wellington's entire line could bring their weapons to bear. The exchange was hideously unequal, French bravery melting away under the steady rhythm of British musketry. Officers fell with their men, their swords useless against the disciplined firepower of professional soldiers who had learned their trade in the harsh school of the Peninsular War. Then came the cavalry. Lord Uxbridge's heavy brigades, the Household Cavalry and the Union Brigade, thundered down the slope in a charge that would be remembered for generations. 2,000 horsemen in gleaming cuirasses and bearskin caps, their sabres reflecting the afternoon sun like silver lightning. The earth shook under their horses' hooves as they crashed into the shattered remnants of d'Erlon's columns. The impact was devastating. French infantry, already bloodied and demoralized by the firefight on the ridge, broke and ran before the avalanche of steel and horsehide. The Union Brigade, composed of English, Scottish, and Irish dragoons, carved through the retreating columns like a scythe through wheat. Their battle cry of Scotland forever echoed across the battlefield as they pursued the fleeing French down the slope. But victory turned to disaster in the space of heartbeats. The British cavalry, drunk on success and the thrill of the charge, pursued too far. They overran French artillery positions, sabering gunners at their pieces, but found themselves isolated and vulnerable on the wrong side of the battlefield. French lancers and cuirassiers, held in reserve for exactly this moment, fell upon the scattered British horsemen with savage efficiency. The slaughter was terrible to behold. Horses and men tumbled together in a confusion of steel and blood. The Union Brigade, which had charged down the slope as conquerors, limped back as a broken remnant. Among the dead lay some of Wellington's finest cavalry officers, men whose experience and leadership could not be replaced. The Duke watched the destruction of his heavy cavalry with the stoic expression that had earned him his iron nickname, but inwardly he must have cursed the impetuosity that had robbed him of a crucial arm of his forces. Napoleon observed these exchanges from his position near the farm of La Belle Alliance, his field glass trained on the ridge where Wellington's army still held its ground. The Emperor's face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his staff officers noted the increasing frequency with which he consulted his watch. Time was becoming his enemy as surely as any coalition army. Each passing hour brought Blücher's Prussians closer to the battlefield, and already there were disturbing reports of enemy columns approaching from the east. The sound that would change everything began as a distant rumble, barely audible above the crash of artillery and musketry. At first, Napoleon's officers dismissed it as an echo of their own guns, but the Emperor's experienced ear detected something different in the rhythm. This was not the irregular thunder of battle, but the steady drumbeat of marching feet. Thousands upon thousands of marching feet, growing louder with each passing minute. Through his telescope, Napoleon could make out the dark columns emerging from the forest of Paris wood. The sight that met his eyes must have struck him like a physical blow. These were not the scattered remnants of a defeated army, but organized formations advancing with Prussian precision. Blücher had kept his word. The old marshal had rallied his forces and was bringing them to Wellington's aid at the very moment when Napoleon needed to concentrate all his strength against the ridge. The Emperor's strategic situation had transformed from difficult to desperate in the span of minutes. Now he faced not one enemy army but two, and they were beginning to coordinate their efforts against him. The anvil of Wellington's ridge and the hammer of Blücher's approach threatened to crush the French army between them. Napoleon had perhaps 2 hours to achieve the decisive victory that had eluded him all day, or face the complete destruction of his forces and his empire. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-soaked fields of Belgium, the Battle of Waterloo entered its final and most savage phase. The Emperor who had once held the fate of Europe in his hands now faced the narrowing window of his last opportunity. Everything he had built, everything he had conquered, everything he had dreamed, would be decided in the next few hours on this unremarkable patch of Belgian countryside. The stage was set for Napoleon's final gamble, the last desperate throw of dice that would either restore his empire or destroy it forever. In the distance, the Prussian drums grew louder, beating out the rhythm of approaching doom for the French cause. The endgame at Waterloo was about to begin. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Napoleon made his final, desperate gamble. The Imperial Guard, those legendary soldiers who had never tasted defeat, began their march up the slope toward Wellington's battered line. 22,000 of Europe's finest warriors, their bearskin caps and polished breastplates gleaming in the fading light. The sight of the Guard advancing sent a ripple of excitement through the French ranks. Surely these invincible veterans would shatter the stubborn Allied resistance that had defied them all day. But the Guard's assault met a withering reception from British infantry who had endured hours of punishment and emerged unbroken. Disciplined volleys tore into the advancing columns, while Wellington himself appeared among his men, shouting the words that would echo through military history. Up, Guards, and at them! The impossible happened before the eyes of both armies. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's ultimate weapon, wavered, broke, and fell back in disorder. The psychological shock rippled across the battlefield like wildfire. French soldiers who had watched the Guards retreat began throwing down their weapons and fleeing toward the rear. The cry that sealed Napoleon's fate rang out across the field. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. Within minutes, the French army dissolved into a panicked mob, streaming away from the ridge that had become their graveyard. Napoleon himself barely escaped capture, his carriage abandoned on the field as he fled on horseback toward Paris. But there would be no miraculous recovery this time, no triumphant return from another exile. 4 days later, the man who had bestrode Europe like a colossus abdicated for the second and final time. His destination would not be the comfortable Mediterranean island of Elba, but the remote South Atlantic rock of St. Helena, where he would spend his final years as a broken prisoner, dying in exile at the age of 51. Waterloo had ended more than just Napoleon's career. It marked the close of an entire era, bringing peace to a continent that had known little but war for over 2 decades. The battle's aftermath would reshape the balance of power in Europe for generations, ushering in a new age where no single nation could dominate the continent as France had under its Corsican emperor. The fields of Belgium had witnessed not just the defeat of an army, but the death of an empire and the birth of a new world order.